I don't think I will go with the normal format here on a Sunday of outlining the 3 upcoming events, because there's only really one that's important coming up in the next week, and that is the anniversary, the 4-year anniversary of Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine. The Russo-Ukrainian war started back in 2014, which means that it's 12 years ago, already 12 years ago, since Russia invaded Ukraine by illegally seizing Crimea and then starting this war in Donbass that was limited in scope until February 24th, 2022. Today is the 22nd, yep. So on Tuesday will be the 4th year anniversary of that invasion. I remember where I was myself back then. I was in Chernovtsi. I'd already evacuated there to be ready to do the full evacuation if needs be when Russia was to invade. Of course, we had a lot of operations, psychological operations by Russia in the information to claim it's all Western propaganda until the moment they actually launched the invasion. And who would have thought on that day, February 20, well, it was actually the second day when I left. We were there on the February 24th, but we actually left on February 25th. When I was at the border, when I was leaving, I shot a vlog for my lifestyle channel. I didn't have this channel at the time. Who would have thought that so soon afterwards, I would have been able to come back to Ukraine. I was back temporarily within about 5 weeks. I'd already crossed back into Ukraine, and then I relocated back by June, so 4 months later. That didn't seem to be what was likely to transpire. The general mood, even amongst the media, was pro-Ukrainian, was that the plucky Ukrainians will resist but have little chance in maintaining their independence and their sovereignty from Russia. Russia would basically overrun the country. Famously, people talked about that it was a 3-day operation that is now over 4 years. Well, I'm not sure the Russians really thought they could take Kyiv in 3 days, but they definitely didn't expect to be still fighting the main part of the operation to seize political control of Ukraine with, we'll say a month later, more or less. Maybe it was really a 3-week operation that now has already, well, on Tuesday will be 4 years long. That's the train wreck of an invasion that Russia has been executing. They are still controlling less than 20% of Ukraine, even if you include what they had illegally seized back in 2014. At the high water point, I guess, in terms of occupation, they controlled around 25% of Ukraine, and then they lost much of those gains with the retreat out of the Kyiv region in the north, and then later the Ukrainian offensives in the Kharkiv Oblast, where they liberated nearly all of Kharkiv, the province, and also they recaptured the city of Kherson, which was the only regional capital that the 2022 invasion led to Russia occupying. They did manage to create a land bridge from Russia de jure down to illegally occupied Crimea. So they seized cities like Melitopol, and then they basically they sacked Mariupol, and we may never know how many civilians they murdered when they captured Mariupol, but they basically sacked the entire city. And as a result, they are the only real gains that they have. Since then, they have made very slow incremental progress, seizing another maybe 2% in the last 3 years at the cost of hundreds of thousands of casualties. If you do the basic math by looking about how many soldiers Russia recruits and how many they actually have left in Ukraine, you come to the conclusion that they have indeed lost well over 1 million soldiers, either missing in action, wounded in action, or killed in action, or maybe they just went AWOL and escaped. Russia's still pretty corrupt, so I guess you could pay part of your sign-up bonus and then escape the front. But whatever is happening, they have definitely lost well over 1 million soldiers, whether they are dead, invalided, or just they went missing. So looking at that, it has been an absolute train wreck. The Russian economy is now in a lot of trouble. As I predicted here in this channel, it's in my lifestyle channel, over 2 years ago, second half of 2025 was the time when Russia is going to need serious solutions to 3 major problems. They are manpower, money, and material. It's like the mantra I keep repeating on this channel, because they need to keep recruiting soldiers for the military. Have tried basically paying huge amounts of money since the beginning of 2023. Now, for the first time, they are losing more soldiers than they're able to recruit over the last few months. This is a serious problem. We have seen in Russia a clampdown now on Telegram, which is a messaging service owned by actually a Russian Pavel Durov, even though he's supposed to be opposition to Putin. We're never 100% sure at times if they've had some sort of rapprochement on that level, but now it has been severely limited, and there are plans afoot to completely ban it by April 1st. That suggests that something major is going to happen that will be very unpopular in Russia by the summer. Could be another general mobilization. That would be probably the most likely. It could also be that Putin is about to give up, and that would mean that he would also need to make sure that Russians who would be opposed to him stopping the war, which is basically the ultranationals, also he would be able to limit their ability to communicate together and potentially overthrow him. I think it's going to more likely to be that they're going to go for mobilization. He's tried very hard to avoid it over the last few years, but now with them losing more soldiers than they're able to recruit, and Ukraine having funding secured from the European Union for another 2 years, means that he needs to keep fighting for at least another 2 years and hope politically that he can repeat the success he's had since Donald Trump became president in the US, where basically the US doesn't supply any aid to Ukraine. They do sell weapons through the European allies of Ukraine, and they do provide some intelligence to Ukraine, but basically they are already leaning pro-Russian basically in the war. So Putin would need to repeat that success. Not that he got Donald Trump directly elected, but I guess he just waited out the US election process and then gives a lot of incentives, or basically is able to control the situation so that Trump sides with him. Doesn't mean that the US is now pro-Russian itself. Donald Trump's not a dictator. There's Congress, and Congress in general is pro-Ukraine. The American population is pro-Ukraine. So we'll see what will happen in the midterms, whether the current administration will become lame duck and whether they will be as advantageous to Moscow. However, the real goal now is to continue out the war until they might be able to change the dynamic in other European countries that support Ukraine, like maybe in France with the elections next year. Maybe there's going to be a surprise general election or an early general election in the UK. Keir Starmer is under a lot of pressure. Reform would seem to be more pro-Russian than the rest of the mainstream, well, I guess significant political parties in the UK. Also, the we'll say hard right in France may win the next election. They also have ties historically to Moscow. Also unclear how strong those would be. In the last few years, they seem to be moving away from their ties with Moscow. However, that will be better than, from a Moscow point of view, than what is currently the situation in Europe. Also, Germany will at some stage, I guess, have new parliamentary elections. They're not scheduled for a few years though. So that would seem to be Putin's plan, and using a general mobilization to keep the steady stream of Russian recruits coming in. Not going to be voluntary, but it would be enough in the medium term to perhaps allow him to get to that point where he can change the dynamics in terms of support for Ukraine. Money, the Russian economy is in a lot of trouble. They're basically in a recession. They might deny it, but the reality is they've been in a recession already for a few months. Inflation is high. The interest rates are high. The economy is contracting, even though they tried to deny it by saying that, by playing a few accounting tricks, but the reality has been contracting. A lot of this balance sheet growth that they had is basically from the war economy, which is, they built a tank, they put X number of million euros or rubles on the balance sheet, and then it's blown up 3 weeks later in Ukraine. It is not in the long term providing value to the Russian economy. It's actually a huge drain, because also you have the people they trained, even if it was only for a few weeks or months, who die in the tank, whatever that they sent out there as material that gets destroyed. So, and then they've already burned through most of their Soviet era stocks. So that also puts a limit on the type of tactics they can now employ in Ukraine, because they cannot continue to use up so much of their military vehicles, because they can't produce them quick enough to replace them. They had these huge stocks that they were refurbishing. They weren't the best, but they were. They figured out a strategy that they could use them for about 2 to 3 years, but now they are going to run very quickly, dangerously low on those, so they can't really continue the same tactics, which is why you've seen on the front, also in part because of the evolution of drone warfare, that now Russia uses less vehicles, these big armored vehicles. They use things like horses. They may even be effective or more effective in using an armored military vehicle, depending on the task. They've used quad bikes, they've used these scrambler motorbikes. They have them with cloaks, trying to walk for not even hours, but days across the front lines to try and infiltrate. And these are very intensive in terms of manpower, Russian manpower getting eliminated on the battlefield. So especially the KIA rate has gone up substantially because it's very hard to evacuate wounded soldiers when they're not even using military armored vehicles, they're just walking, so the chance of being able to get them back if they get injured is very low. So basically you're seeing a situation where Vladimir Putin, in order to continue the war, because remember, Vladimir Putin's first priority every morning he wakes up is to figure out how to stay in power tomorrow. It's not actually to win the war, because he may set up the conditions to win the war and then actually get removed from power. This is something that he wants to avoid. And in order to not stop the war, which would mean a lot of presumably angry, disenfranchised, and psychologically traumatized men who have been used to using violence coming back to Russia and creating a huge number of problems for his government. If he wants to keep it going, he's going to have to go for general mobilization. It's almost certain at this point, and that's probably the most likely reason we see Telegram being limited at the moment. So we'll have to see what happens in the next few months. The situation on the battlefield in Ukraine is that for the first time in a while, Ukraine is actually making more gains than Russia. So again, that is something that's happened pretty recently. Starlink was basically cut off for Russia, so they seem to have an issue with their communications. Why they were ever able to use Starlink in the first place, since it's the US military and other allies of Ukraine actually pay Starlink for their services, is a mystery to me, but at least now something has been done about it and seems to have coincided with this series of counterattacks, I would say, for a moment by Ukraine, but they have taken back more territory than the Russians have been able to gain over the last few months. So that is telling that things have stalled out on the battlefield. Putin probably needs to make a number of very uncomfortable decisions. His economy is in trouble. As it contracts, also it's important to point out that they're using up much of their gold reserves to keep it going. The price that they get in the global market for their resources is declining. It is very low. The price of oil is quite low at the moment. This is a major problem for Russia in terms of getting foreign currency, hard currency, and their shadow fleet is also being targeted by the US. It's one of the things that Trump is doing that is against Russia's interests at the moment, and that also makes it more expensive for Russia to be able to sell its resources abroad. So all these things are meaning they have less income coming in. They have a budget that's published that says 40% of the budget is to go on the military and basically crushing the internal dissent, but basically governing using the security services in Russia or abroad. 40%, and that's based on a budget that means they're going to be taking in more money than in reality they're likely to take in this year. So it's going to be way higher than 40%. It's going to be problematic. Russia is in a lot of trouble. So as we come up to the 4th anniversary of the invasion of 2022, my prediction has been that in 2026, it is about a 50-50 whether we'll see a pause in the fighting in Ukraine, but in 2027, the probability is way higher. I put it at 80% because I just don't see how Russia is going to keep going. But obviously, Putin going for mobilization will give him the manpower capability to go on for longer, but at the same time going to undermine his legitimacy and popularity amongst the elite in Moscow and amongst the general public, which could weaken his grip on power as we go into 2027. So quite optimistic for 2027, reasonably optimistic for 2026. And my message as we come up for the 4th anniversary is keep supporting Ukraine. There is light at the end of the tunnel. If we think back 4 years, no one thought that Ukraine was going to last basically more than a month. And in fact, they have lasted more than 4 years. Well, we're coming up to the 4th year, and Russia still only controls less than 20% of Ukrainian territory. So on that note, I will say Slava Ukraini, do перемоги, and stay tuned for more in 2026 and keep supporting Ukraine in any way you can, because it is not just a noble cause, but also one that looks closer and closer to coming out in favor of Ukraine over Moscow and its empire control from the Kremlin. Do побачення!